All right then, so to get started, we're just going to set our app up and we're going to create all of the migrations that we need. Now, we're not going to cover everything in one go, but the reason we want to set up migrations all in one go is because we really need to think about this into the future. So before we start to go through each step, roles, permissions, and then permissions through roles, we need to know that we have the database schema that will handle this. So let's start by just going ahead and making our authentication scaffolding. Very simple. And let's go ahead and run our migrations as well. Now, I already have my database credentials all set up. And if I just open my database here, there they are. So I'm using Postgres, but of course this is going to work in the same way for MySQL as well. So what we need to do is if we just come over and go ahead and start by generating our permission model. So we're going to have two models here, permission and role, and then we're going to create a trait to link everything together. So let's create a permission model with a migration, and let's go ahead and create a role model with a migration as well. Now these are the simplest because roles and permissions just very simply have names. That is pretty much all we're going to do in there. So let's just come over to database, over to migrations, and we'll go ahead and set these up. So for our permissions table, this is very simple. It has an ID and it has a name. So let's go ahead and say table string name. Now in terms of permissions, we know from the introduction, we're going to have things like edit posts, delete topics. These are just general things that we can do. They're not a substitute for authorization within Laravel. If you're used to working with authorization, you'll know that within a controller, you can do something like this, authorize. This is more on a kind of user level. So we're kind of thinking a general level. So hopefully that makes sense. We'll go ahead and fill in our roles schema and go ahead and migrate these. So again, this is really simple. We're just going to have a name in there. That will be things like admin or user or super admin and whatever you want to do. So let's go ahead and run our migrations again, and they're created. Now we can get on to our pivot tables. So at the simplest level, users can have a permission. So we know that we've got permissions created. Let's go ahead and create the pivot table to link up any permissions we've created with specific users. So let's go ahead and say PHP Artisan make migration. And this is going to be creating and what I'm going to do is not follow Laravel's convention. So for a conventional pivot table, we would do this in alphabetical order. So really what we would do here is we would create a permissions users table, but I find it's a lot easier to say users permissions table, just because it kind of orders things when you're working within some kind of graphical user interface. And we'll go ahead and cover that in the relationship when we set that up. So let's go ahead and say that we want to create users underscore permissions, and we're done. So let's fill this out very quickly just so we can kind of get a feel for how this is going to work. The one thing that we don't need is an incrementing ID. And of course, we don't even need timestamps in here. You can include them if you want to know when a permission was assigned, but really there's not really much need. So the two things that we need in here are a user ID and a permission ID. So let's create a user ID. This is going to be unsigned, and let's go ahead and create our permission ID. So just to link up a user and a permission. So what I'm also going to do is set up foreign key constraints. Not only does this mean that when a user is deleted, their permission links are deleted too. It also means that depending on the graphical user interface you're using, you also see that nice table drop down. So if you are manually fiddling around with your database, it's a lot easier as well. So let's go ahead and set up a foreign key constraint here. And we're going to say that the user ID on this table references the ID, of course, on the users table. So we go ahead and fill that in. And then really importantly, we want to say on deletion of a user, we want to cascade and delete the link that we have set up here. And we're going to do the same thing for the permissions as well. So permission ID references the ID on the permissions table, and we do the same thing. So now we just want to set up primary keys for both the user ID and the permission ID. So very simply, we just say user ID and permission ID, and we are done. So let's go ahead and migrate this just to make sure we don't have any problems. And there we go. Okay, so the next one is the users roles table. So a user can have a role. So let's go ahead and generate this. So PHP Artisan make migration, and again, create users roles table regardless of the order of this. And let's go ahead and say create users roles. So we pretty much want to do exactly the same thing as we've just done. We're just assigning a user to a particular role. And in this case, I just find it easier to copy what I've already done here and just switch everything over. So we're going to get rid of these two, pop that in there, and we can go ahead and set this up. So this is now going to be a user who has a specific role. And again, we can change this over to role ID, this over to roles. And again, we can say user ID and role ID. So exactly the same thing. Go ahead and migrate. And that's our user and role link set up. So the next thing is, under a particular role, a role will have permissions. So a user might have permission to post a topic, and admin might have the permission to edit and delete a topic. So we need that set up as well. So this is our last one. So let's go ahead and create this, make a migration. Let's create the roles permissions table and pass the create flag in. So we get all of that nice scaffolding built for us. Roles, permissions, and we're done. So let's go over to this. And again, this is pretty similar. We just have a role ID and a permission ID, and we link the two together. So again, we can just take this kind of setup and pop it in here just to save a little bit of time. So we have a role ID and a permission ID. So let's switch that over like so. And this will be role ID. That references the ID on the roles table, and the permission ID references the ID on the permissions table. And again, we just switch these over. So we have our primary keys in there, role ID and permission ID. And if any of this doesn't make quite enough sense, then it will do when we start to look at the relationships between things. So don't worry too much if this is a little bit overwhelming. Sometimes these things can get a little bit confusing. So let's migrate that. And with that done, we are pretty much set up to go. What we need to do though is of course set up the relationship between permissions and roles, later on users with permissions and roles and all that kind of stuff. So we'll just kind of briefly dive into this now with a permission and roles. We'll set up our trait quickly, and then we'll be in good position to go ahead and implement any of the methods that we've seen. So we know that a user has permissions and roles, but let's focus on permission first of all. We know that if we go ahead and have a permission, we have a many-to-many relationship between roles and permissions. So we need to go ahead and set up a many-to-many relationship inside of here. So it belongs to many, and we're using the role class here. And because we have named our table in a specific way, which may not adhere to Laravel's convention, we're going to say define that in there specifically. Now we do pretty much the reverse on role, because a role has many permissions, a permission has many roles. So let's go ahead and say, in this case, a role has many permissions. Change this over to permission, like so. And then again, we have the same pivot table in here as we did before. So in terms of the user then, a user has many roles, a user has many permissions, or can potentially, and a role has many users and permissions have many users. So we need to set up a many-to-many relationship on our user model. What we're not going to do though is stick this all inside of the user model. We're going to split this out into a trait to make it a little bit easier to manage. So if we maybe introduced another model later on, we could just very conveniently use that trait in here. And I always like to do that. So it really doesn't matter where you put this. You can go ahead and choose pretty much any location. But what I'm going to do is create a permissions folder inside of my app directory, and I'm going to create this trait just inside of here. So this is going to be something along the lines of has permissions. You can leave it like that, but convention says that we should really give a trait postfix to any traits that we create. So I'm going to go ahead and stick trait on the end of there. Again, entirely up to you. You do what you want. So let's go ahead and set the namespace up, permissions, and this is a trait, and it's a has permissions trait, and there we go. So let's go over to user, and let's use this at the top. So use app permissions and has permissions trait, and very simply go ahead and use that in there, and we're done. So over in has permissions, this is where we have our relationship set up between a user or any other model that's kind of authenticatable and you can sign in as. We want roles and permissions, and again, it's pretty much the same thing. So we have roles here and we have permissions. So we now have, after we've implemented these two methods, a nice flexible relationship set up between everything that we could possibly need. So let's say that this belongs to many once again, and again, this is going to be role class. We're outside of the app directory now, so we need to go ahead and import this. So app role, and we're going to do the same thing for permission, and just using this syntax, I'm going to go ahead and pull these in. Just makes a little bit more sense. So again, we need to define out the pivot table here. This is users roles, and then we can pretty much duplicate this down and say that a user has many permissions. And again, this is our users permissions table, and that is pretty much it. Now that is really the kind of bulk of the work done. All we really need now is inside of this trait, some helpful methods that we can implement to check or at least assign roles, assign permissions maybe, all of this kind of stuff. And then everything will just work nicely. And as we saw in the introduction, we can then, after we've done a little bit of setup using Laravel authorization, we can use that can method on any of our models and it will just work. So that's our setup done. If anything goes wrong here, we'll fix it up a little bit later on, but that's the bulk of the relationships done. Just remember, a user has many roles, a user has many permissions, permissions have many roles, roles have many permissions, and vice versa. It's just a nice setup, so we're ready to go. So let's jump over and in the next part, look at checking if a user has a particular role.